Like I'm waiting for the date I found on Craigslist. We genuinely get along great considering that we have been talking for months. We have been speaking virtually daily. The man, who is approximately my age 24, shares my interests. He revealed a lot about his life and attended a nearby school. We have simply communicated via text messages, yet we already know a lot about one another. We agreed it was time to meet in person, so I proposed that we go for a stroll, meet in a park, or have coffee. He concurred, and we agreed to meet at the city park at 11:00 a.m. on a Saturday. I'm currently seated on the bench. Remember that I received no forewarnings from this individual. I even had his phone number and had contacted him a couple times. I couldn't help but wonder why he hadn't arrived yet as I sat on the bench. He was 15 minutes late, and it was already 11:15. I sat there taking in the vista and the fresh air because I'm not the sort to be pushy or demanding. The birds were singing their morning song as the trees swayed in the wind. Now that it was 11:30, I was beginning to get a little irritated. For the 90th time, I decided to check my phone to see if he had called or texted me, but there was nothing. I sent him a text asking, "Hey, where are you?" around 11:40, and I can definitely recall this. I sent that and then sat, waiting for a few minutes with my phone on the bench next to me. My phone made a sound almost quickly after I set it down. It was a letter he had written, even if it wasn't his genuine name. We'll call him Steven. But then I was astonished by something that happened unexpectedly. I checked the message he had sent after unlocking my phone. There was no voicemail, and he didn't try to call me. Instead, he emailed me a picture of an elderly woman sprawled out on the ground in what appeared to be an apartment's corridor. He was still typing when I realized it, and I was eagerly awaiting an explanation. It absolutely shocked me because I had no idea what was happening. I waited there impatiently anticipating what he would say next. He finally sent a lengthy message after roughly a minute had passed. It added, "This is my grandma," in the message. He informed me that his grandmother had died after suffering a heart attack. In the past, when someone's grandma passed away, people would typically feel bad and sad for that person, but I didn't feel anything like that. Instead, I thought it was quite odd and unsettling that he emailed me a picture of her sprawled out in his apartment's hallway. I spotted a paramedic's bag next to her as I examined the image more closely. It was obvious that he snatched it while they were assisting her. He described how he had discovered her lying in the hallway of the flat. They attempted to revive her after her heart stopped, but because she was in her mid-90s, it was challenging. They tried to revive her, but it didn't work. I could only manage to type "I'm very sorry," which was extremely difficult for me to do. I put my phone down and inhaled deeply. This wasn't what I had anticipated happening on a Saturday morning. I didn't even ask him because it appeared that the date had been postponed. I stood up and walked over to my car from the bench. It took me around 35 minutes to drive the 20 minutes or whatever it took me to leave to get home. My phone was flooded with calls and messages from this guy when I arrived home. He still wanted to go on the date, so I checked. He just saw his grandma's passing, and I didn't like the notion of him still wanting to go out with me. I started to wonder if he was indeed depressed or grieving. Surprisingly yet, he wanted to keep the original date for that day. I was a little perplexed. I mean, I get it. It was his grandma, not his parents, nor his siblings, nor his wife, nor his spouse. I suppose that makes sense now. You may get over the loss of someone you aren't really close to more quickly. Even though that sounds bizarre, it's the truth, and you can't argue with it. It hurts worse when someone dear to you passes away. However, I was still baffled as to why this guy would want to go on a date the same day that he had just seen anything of that nature. It would seriously ruin me. Perhaps he was simply emotionally aloof. I agreed and informed him that I was prepared to meet because I was still game for the date. He proposed that we meet at 5:30 in the park. I nodded in agreement, but as soon as I did, I saw that it was the end of winter and that it was getting dark at around 6:00 or 7:00 p.m. I felt a little worried about that because I knew the park would be almost deserted by then. But it was too late to back out. I had already accepted. Despite the fact that we had been speaking every day for the previous few months, I felt stuck and trusted this man despite this. It was probably 4 hours of doing other things between saying yes and actually going to the park, but I can't recall what I did during that time. I believe that I cleaned my home and consumed some food. I thought it was time to leave when I noticed the time had approached 5. This time, I wanted to arrive early because I assumed he would as well. I locked up my house, got in my car, and went down to the park in the center of town. My automobile nearly stopped in the same place as before, and I instantly noted how much quieter the park was this time around. There were scarcely any automobiles parked along the roads that surrounded the park. I just happened to notice it. I'm not trying to claim that I was afraid at this point since, even though it was probably not a good idea to do so, I truly trusted this man. I exited my vehicle, secured it, and made my way over to the bench area, where I had previously waited for roughly an hour that morning. When I arrived, he was already seated. He was wearing a leather jacket, spectacles, and had his legs crossed. I had only seen pictures of him, but I had to admit that he didn't at all resemble those pictures. First of all, he claimed to be 6'2" when I am 5'10", which is very tall for a girl, so that was the first warning sign. I am aware that many guys today lie about their height. It happens. He didn't first notice me coming. As I approached, I believed I should have opted for heels. Oh boy, it's going to be uncomfortable. When he eventually turned around, I must have been approximately 15 steps away from him. He seemed to kind of step back a little when I surprised him, I believe. He stood up from the bench and walked over to give me a hug. We gave each other our customary cheek kisses, and everything appeared sweet and courteous. He spoke exactly as he had on the phone. His height and face were the only things that were different, but I was unable to determine if he had applied a filter or had his images professionally retouched with Photoshop or CGI. He didn't actually resemble him at all. Regardless, we both sat down on the bench and struck up a conversation. After speaking for months, we finally met in person. We then discussed our childhoods and other topics. I was still trying to comprehend the reality that his grandma had passed away earlier that morning, and he had found her, yet he appeared happier than ever. He had a laid-back demeanor. After around 30 minutes of conversation, he recommended that we go have some dinner. I concurred, so we got to our feet and headed into town. It was convenient since the downtown park was directly across from Main Street. In the end, we had pizza and a few beers at an Italian restaurant. Both the food and our discussion were excellent. We even engaged in some flirtation occasionally. He wasn't very beautiful to me, but he was a nice guy to be around and quite a slick talker. There's no denying that. But as soon as we were done eating, something unexpected happened. I almost immediately observed a shift in his demeanor, like he knew our date was coming to an end. He paid for everything and even held the door open for me as we left the Italian eatery. I was beginning to like him because of how pleasant he was being. He held the door for me, turned to me, and was the first to go. Then he bossily remarked, "You're coming to my apartment." "Pardon me?" "Yes, you're visiting me at home." "Okay, no, sorry. Sorry, I'm unable to visit you there. I need to return home." "You're going to my house, not mine." It was as though he had overnight assumed ownership of me. A date that had been so pleasant, laid back, and delightful up until this point had quickly changed into something I can't even begin to describe. To say I was uneasy wouldn't even come close. I was standing there and felt forced to accompany this man to his residence. I attempted to come up with every justification under the sun, stating I had to return since my friend needed me, but he remained silent. He simply gave me a look I had never seen from him before as he glared at me. Immediately uncomfortable and uneasy. The Steven I had been on a date with for the last few hours was not this Steven. I'm not sure if it was the alcohol or me saying no, but this guy had totally transformed. After thanking him for the date and deciding to take a chance, I turned to the right and quickly started walking back towards the downtown park in order to get to my car. I then heard him approaching from behind me. He suddenly seized my arm and drew me back to him. He was there. "No, you're going with me," he replied as he drew me in closer. I hit him in the face and attempted to kick him in the groin in response, but he was defending himself. At this time, he was holding both of my arms, and I had to struggle to defend myself. I screamed loudly, and it reverberated off the structures on either side of the street. My cries for assistance caused fear in the crowded high street. After that, a lot of people actually turned to look at us, and a number of men came over to help me. The man eventually walked away after being kicked away and told to leave. I was shaking uncontrollably and sobbing a lot. It appeared as though this man was attempting to entrap me against my will. I was utterly perplexed, and my thoughts were jumbled. He had been genuinely kind and a pleasure to be with at the beginning and for the majority of our evening. But as soon as I responded, no, he changed entirely and became really cruel. The police and an ambulance were offered to be called by the large crowd that had assembled, but I didn't need them. The man had been aggressive, but he had already left. That was the end of it. He had vanished into the night of the city. I'm sorry to say it, but he might have had behavioral or major mental health difficulties. Whether it was autism or something else, the fact remains that he lacked empathy and emotion. He was really upset when I said no and attempted to get me to go with him. I will never longer meet anyone through Craigslist. It can be dangerous to use dating applications like Tinder. I take care to only communicate with verified individuals and do video talks with them in advance of meetings. I make an effort to meet them in person with friends, family, in a group situation, or while participating in a sport. I can stay out of situations like these by doing this. My household and I required a break. It was so stressful that we had to leave the city. My spouse and I both worked full-time jobs. He was employed in an office and I was a nursery worker. Even while I adored working with kids, there were moments when it was challenging. More than 30 raucous 4-year-olds might make managing them a nightmare rather than a dream. So last month, we were looking for a vacation property on Craigslist. Please don't laugh, but regrettably, we didn't have much money, therefore we couldn't afford a trip to a pricey luxury hotel. In retrospect, using Craigslist wasn't the best move. Airbnb is safer and has some regulations for homeowners who rent out their properties, so we probably should have used that instead. However, there were other possibilities on Craigslist, so I started looking at vacation rentals and homes. We desired to travel outside of the city, especially to a rural area near farmland. Because there wasn't much to see in the country, the rents were relatively affordable. Not many people were interested in that because it was mostly cows, grass, and trees. We also chose the rural areas since my kids were constantly using their smartphones. So, in the end, we made a reservation. It's a charming small cottage with a few more structures on the outskirts of a sizable farm. The person renting it claimed to be the farm's sole owner and charged us $100 a night to stay in the cottage. That appeared to be okay, because we also received a fence and a small garden of our own. I got in touch with the owner and let him know I needed to leave a security deposit with him. I quickly got him to agree after asking. Let's move on from the challenging process of preparing my family. Only 2 children. I won't go into all the specifics of how difficult it was to get everyone ready. Just picture it. A 5-hour car ride filled with fights, stomping, yelling, and temper tantrums. The actual journey just took a few hours, which wasn't too bad. I was pleasantly impressed by how good the entire house looked when we arrived. That is until I reached the main portion of the property. The estate's front gates were once made of brand new, shining metal. On both sides, there were a few statues that resembled stone columns. But as we traveled deeper, the situation seemed to be becoming worse. Some of the structures had missing bricks and mounds and were in disrepair, old and shattered, looking like they were from the 1940s. Some of the windows, they had only one glass layer because they were single glazed. Not a good beginning. However, after following the owner's instructions, we were able to locate the tiny bungalow or cottage we had paid to rent. We had paid for a whole week, which seemed excessive to me, but we could not continue. Additionally, I didn't want to stay any longer, especially after visiting the location. So, there we were in front of this structure. That wasn't even a cottage in our truck. It appeared to have been constructed by hand using bricks that resembled cobblestones a very long time ago. I put the truck in neutral while it was still moving. I was driving while my hubby was taking turns. We hadn't departed until after 3 p.m., which resulted in all the temper outbursts and disputes. As we sat there in front of the cottage, I questioned whether the journey was worthwhile. I therefore decided to investigate. Whether it was even appropriate to stay there needed to be determined. It didn't appear to be a location where people could reside happily. Even though it was summer, I didn't think the building's holes were appropriate because we hadn't come here to camp. I was desperate to get my money back, and I wanted it now. I resisted my husband's attempts to persuade me that this was typical. I continued to argue as I got out of the car to investigate the location. But after locking the car and telling the kids to stay inside, my husband and I went to investigate. The owner had advised us that the key would be under the floor mat, and we discovered it there. I had no trouble getting the door open. It wasn't quite as horrible as I had anticipated when we stepped inside. My spouse was trying to explain that it merely appeared to be horrible from the outside when I went silent. Well, as we went from room to room, I began to believe that perhaps he was correct. The 3-bedroom cottage was neat and clean, and the bathroom wasn't leaking sewage or coated in mounds. Given how it appeared from the outside, it was surprising to see that the interior of the building was rather nice. So, we chose to stay. The children were invited into the truck when I unlocked it. We arrived with all of our luggage and settled in. It was now almost 4:00 p.m., and we began to unwind. Even though the furnishings, appliances, and everything else inside were ancient, it wasn't bad. The cottage's outside was in poor shape, but the interior had been maintained well. It appeared that they had made some modifications and installed new flooring. We still had dinner to make as the evening drew near. In addition to dry pasta, rice, sauces, and even some meats that were in our cooler in the back, I had purchased a large number of goods. We were planning to have spaghetti bolognese on the first night, and that's when things started to go awry. I was starting to settle in and unwind at that point. My husband was sitting and watching the small old TV while I was in the kitchen, and the kids were using their iPads in their rooms. While cooking in the kitchen, I found myself fantasizing for some reason that I can't explain. I turned to face the window. I was beginning to relish this sense of tranquility. Normally, all I could see was the city's continual noise and bright lights, along with the hectic traffic on the street below. I'll be honest, even though I grew accustomed to it, it still gave me the willies. I simply adapted to it over time. Everything was going fine while I was cooking. Making the bolognese didn't take me that long, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Just the ground meat and pasta needed to be cooked. The prepared sauce was delivered in a jar. I added the sauce, combined everything, and heated it in a sizable frying pan I had purchased. And yes, I was a little picky. It was odd that my younger daughter preferred to eat her pasta and bolognese separately. She wanted to eat the bolognese meat and sauce in one bowl with the spaghetti in another without any sauce. I cooked everything and made her bowls, and then I invited everyone to the kitchen table and served the food. The kitchen table was made of carved wood and was rather old. It was arguably the prettiest piece in the house and appeared to have been handmade. My husband, who was still engrossed in the outdated tiny television, would disagree though. My young daughter stated something odd just as we were getting ready to have supper and were all seated at the table. She picked up her fork just as she was about to begin eating her spaghetti and asked her mother, "Mom, why is it green?" I didn't give it much thought as I glanced over, but when I got closer, I saw that it did have a somewhat greenish hue. I thought the pasta's greenish hue was a little strange. It had already been incorporated into the crimson bolognese sauce and meat on our plates, so I couldn't see it. I reassured her that nothing was wrong and made up the tale that it was a different variety of spaghetti. I wasn't being completely honest, but the 2 hours of driving and the anxiety of seeing the outside of this property had left me drained. We all completed our supper, and the difficulty didn't last more than a few hours. My husband had to go to the bathroom first since he was vomiting a lot. My daughter then developed extremely nasty diarrhea. We later discovered that the water we used to boil the pasta, which came from a well close to the cottage on the farm, was contaminated. To put a long and unpleasant tale short, our stomach issues were all caused by it because it hadn't undergone any safety testing. Following that, we all fell ill and had to spend 4 days inside the cottage. It was a difficult moment. We immediately returned home after we had recovered. However, we had to have doctors come in while we were ill. My 2 youngest children's frequent vomiting and diarrhea nearly caused them to become dehydrated at one time. As a result, I wouldn't consider it a vacation, and it was not at all restful. After that, we didn't hear back from the owner of the farm and estate. My husband and I didn't want to file any legal claims since we simply didn't want to deal with it. But there was unquestionably a problem with the water. It had a greenish hue, and it was obvious that the well was tainted with germs of some sort that didn't sit well with our stomachs. Those 4 days were just horrible. My husband ended up remaining in one bathroom while my 2 kids slept in the other because we were in such a dire situation. I utilized a big bowl I discovered in the kitchen while remaining outside. They used this sizable dish for combining flour and baking. Fortunately, I did not have diarrhea, but I was still terribly ill. Although we all made an effort to sleep it off, sobbing and vomiting persisted throughout those 4 days. The toughest day was the 3rd, when we had to call 911 due to the presence of my youngest daughter. She consistently failed to finish the liquids she tried to drink. I had to fight off my growing fear because calling 911 was difficult for me because I was so exhausted. We all received shots in our behinds to stop the vomiting when the medical crew arrived. We all felt better after the shots, so it was effective. Finally, we all made a full recovery and went back to our homes. I decided to purchase one of those doorbell cameras from Craigslist about 6 months ago to monitor the front of our home. When someone knocks on your door, they let you know. My area, where I have resided for 3 years, is densely populated. In addition, my wife and I just had our first child, so I thought getting one was a smart idea. I installed an app and set up the camera. No matter where I am, the app alerts me if anything moves close to my front door. I was awakened at 2:00 in the morning, the first night after setting it up, because the app had alerted me that something had moved close to my front door. I was genuinely shocked when I received this message. I opened the app to check on the situation. I was genuinely alarmed when I noticed a man's face staring directly into the camera. Then I understood it was Dan, my neighbor. When the camera was on, he was making a silly face. I was a little perplexed, but I later reasoned that Dan probably spotted the camera being set up and had come over to tease me. For almost 5 minutes, he kept moving around, gazing at the camera and making silly faces. Then he left. Dan and I had a few conversations, but I didn't know him very well. I returned to sleep after that, feeling considerably better. The following day, I had intended to go see Dan and talk to him, but when I woke up, I had completely forgotten about it. It wasn't until a few days later that I gave it significant consideration. On a Friday evening, I stayed up late watching TV. I then received a further alert that something had moved close to my front door. My neighbor Dan was once more there when I checked the app, but he didn't appear to be in a good mood. Simply pointing towards the camera, I went to the front door to surprise him because I assumed he was making light of it once more. However, as soon as I opened the door, he bolted into my yard and leaped the small fence separating our yards. I found that to be extremely unusual, but as I've already mentioned, I didn't know Dan all that well, so perhaps this was just his way of having fun. The following day, I decided to go talk to Dan after recalling what had occurred. When he opened the door when I knocked, I told him I enjoyed his practical joke. I explained what I had seen on my camera to him when he inquired about what I was trying to say. He denied visiting my residence at night and claimed he had no idea what I was referring to. He appeared astonished when I gave him the video as proof. He apologized and claimed he was unaware of it. I assured him it was all right and left for my house. Dan claims he hasn't done it again since, but I'm not sure if I believe him or not. I hope it continues that way.